In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers vanished along a 20-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. Each disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only scattered belongings and abandoned horses that told no story of their fate. What makes these disappearances truly chilling isn't just their sheer number, but the fact that local authorities deliberately buried every record of the subsequent investigation. For over 2 centuries, the truth about the Hardin family farm remained hidden in sealed court documents until a county clerk's 1987 discovery revealed the most disturbing case of organized murder in early American frontier history. The documents describe a killing operation so methodical, so perfectly disguised as Christian charity, that it operated for 8 years without detection. Before we continue with the story of the farm that became Kentucky's first house of horrors, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover secrets that powerful families tried to keep buried forever. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. The discovery that would eventually expose the Hardin family's crimes began not with screams in the night, but with the simple act of bureaucratic housekeeping in a dusty courthouse basement. The Wilderness Road and Millfield setting. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where the promise of prosperity drew thousands westward along treacherous mountain paths. The Wilderness Road, carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 2 decades earlier, had become the primary artery for settlers moving west from the Carolinas and Virginia. This narrow, winding trail stretched for over 200 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America, where a single misstep could mean death from wild animals, exposure, or the countless human predators who haunted the frontier. Along this treacherous path, dozens of small communities had sprouted like wildflowers after rain. Each one a beacon of hope for families seeking new beginnings in the untamed frontier. These settlements served as crucial waypoints where exhausted travelers could resupply, rest, and gather information about the dangers that lay ahead. The success or failure of these communities often depended on their ability to provide safe haven for the constant stream of migrants who passed through their borders. The township of Millfield sat at a crucial bend in the road, where the trail descended from the rocky ridges into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. With barely 300 souls, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The town had been established in 1794 by a group of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, and their influence could be seen in every aspect of community life. Sunday services were mandatory for all residents, and the town council enforced strict moral codes that governed everything from dancing to drinking. The settlement centered around Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log building that served as both informal courthouse and trading post. Jeremiah Hendricks, a gruff former militiaman who had fought Indians alongside Daniel Boone himself, ran the establishment with a keen eye for profit and an iron fist. His store stocked everything a traveler might need: salt, gunpowder, whiskey, blankets, and the latest news from the civilized world beyond the mountains. Nearby stood the Cumberland Inn, a 2-story structure that represented the height of frontier luxury. Martha Crane, the widow who operated the inn, had arrived from Philadelphia 5 years earlier with enough money to build the finest accommodations between the Virginia border and Lexington. Travelers could find a clean bed and a hot meal for 2 bits a night, along with the kind of civilized conversation that reminded them of the world they had left behind. The town's spiritual center was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a modest log building that could hold the entire population during Sunday services. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-educated minister who had abandoned a comfortable Boston pastorate for frontier missions, delivered sermons that blended practical advice for survival in an unforgiving land with traditional theology. His presence gave Millfield a sense of legitimacy that attracted settlers who might otherwise have passed through without stopping. The Hardins, pillars of the community. Among Millfield's most respected residents were the Hardins, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 adult children, sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. The family had arrived in the spring of 1791, claiming to be refugees from brutal Indian raids that had devastated their previous home in eastern Virginia. They quickly established themselves as pillars of the small community, with Ezekiel serving as a lay preacher who assisted Reverend Cole, and Temperance organizing charitable efforts for struggling families who arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs. Ezekiel Hardin was a man who commanded respect through sheer force of personality. Standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a lifetime laborer, he possessed the kind of physical presence that made other men step aside when he entered a room. His deep voice could fill the church without effort, delivering sermons that moved listeners to tears with their passionate descriptions of divine love and terrible warnings about eternal judgment. Those who heard him preach often remarked that he seemed to speak with the authority of someone who had personally witnessed both heaven and hell. Temperance Harden was equally impressive in her own way. A small, delicate woman with prematurely grey hair and hands that never seemed to rest, she had quickly become the community's unofficial physician. Her knowledge of healing herbs was encyclopedic, and she could treat everything from difficult births to broken bones with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. More than one family owed their lives to her midnight visits during times of crisis, and her reputation for medical miracles had spread throughout the county. Their children appeared to be perfect examples of frontier virtue. Caleb, the elder son at 26, possessed his father's imposing physical presence and his mother's gentle demeanor. He worked the family farm with tireless dedication while finding time to help elderly neighbors with their own crops. Josiah, 24, was smaller but more intellectual, often serving as the community's unofficial schoolmaster during the winter months when farm work slowed. At 22, Mercy was considered one of the most beautiful young women in the county, with a sweet disposition that made her popular among both women and men. The prosperous farm and extraordinary hospitality. The Harden farm sprawled across 400 acres of prime bottomland along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. The land had cost Ezekiel nearly every penny he possessed, but the investment had proven wise. The rich soil produced abundant crops of tobacco and corn, while the creek provided water for livestock and power for a small grist mill that served the surrounding area. Visitors often remarked on the farm's unusual prosperity, noting that the Hardens seemed to have more material wealth than could be explained by farming alone. Ezekiel had built his homestead with careful attention to both security and comfort. The main house was a 2-story log structure with glass windows and stone chimneys, an almost unheard-of luxury on the frontier. The rooms were furnished with pieces that seemed far too fine for a simple farming family: silver candlesticks, imported china, carved chairs, and books that suggested refinement and education. A massive barn could shelter 50 horses, while a network of outbuildings included a dairy, smokehouse, blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel described as the largest root cellar in the county. What made the Hardens particularly valuable to the community was their willingness to help travelers in distress. The frontier was unforgiving to those who traveled unprepared or alone, and barely a week passed without someone arriving at the farm seeking assistance. More than once, Ezekiel had ridden out in dangerous weather to assist an injured horse or a broken wagon, often inviting stranded families to shelter at his farm until repairs could be made. Such hospitality was considered a Christian duty on the frontier, but the Hardens took it to extraordinary lengths. Temperance was particularly known for her willingness to treat injured or sick travelers regardless of their ability to pay. Her medical skills had saved countless lives, and many families continued their journeys only because of her intervention. She maintained a well-stocked infirmary in one of the outbuildings, complete with medications and surgical instruments that most frontier doctors could only dream of possessing. The family's reputation for hospitality had grown so strong that by 1798, it was common for travelers to specifically seek out the Harden farm when planning their journey. Local guides regularly directed parties toward Beaver Creek, assuring them that the Hardens would provide safe shelter for the night and fair prices for supplies. The family's guest book, which Mercy maintained with careful attention to detail, recorded hundreds of visitors over the years, families, merchants, ministers, and solitary adventurers who had found refuge at the prosperous farm. But in the harsh reality of frontier life, where trust could be fatal and death lurked behind every tree, appearances could be more than deceiving. They could be deadly. The first disappearance, Samuel Fletcher. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington as scheduled. Fletcher was no ordinary traveler. He was one of the most reliable and experienced merchants on the Wilderness Road, a man whose punctuality had made him wealthy in a world where timing could mean the difference between devastating loss and profit. For 12 years, he had made the dangerous journey between Kentucky and Virginia 4 times annually, carrying raw materials east and manufactured goods west. Fletcher's business partner, Thomas Greeley, had worked with the merchant long enough to know his habits intimately. Fletcher never took unnecessary risks that might jeopardize his valuable cargo, and he never deviated from his planned schedule without sending word. When Greeley received no word after 5 days, 2 days beyond Fletcher's promised arrival, he knew something catastrophic had occurred. Greeley's search began at dawn on October 18, following Fletcher's known route backward from Lexington. He questioned farmers, merchants, and innkeepers along the way, each of whom confirmed that Fletcher had passed through on schedule. The trail remained clear until Greeley reached the vicinity of Mill Field, where Fletcher seemed to have simply vanished from existence. The discovery of Fletcher's horse came at noon on the second day of searching. The distinctive bay mare was found grazing loose near Miller's Creek, still wearing its saddle but showing no signs of distress or injury. The animal appeared well fed and cared for, as if it had been deliberately released rather than abandoned in panic. Most puzzling of all, the horse's bridle had been removed and hung carefully on a nearby tree branch, an act that suggested human intervention rather than accident. Fletcher's saddlebags remained intact, containing his trading goods and a leather pouch with nearly $50 in silver coins, a fortune that represented months of dangerous work. The money's presence ruled out simple robbery, the most common explanation for frontier disappearances. Even more disturbing, Fletcher's personal effects were scattered in a deliberate line leading away from the road toward the interior woodlands, as if he had been forced to drop them one by one while being dragged from his horse. Constable Winters' investigation. The local constable, Jacob Winters, was a man uniquely qualified to investigate such mysteries. A former Continental Army sergeant who had served under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns, Winters possessed both the stomach for violence and the investigative skills that frontier law enforcement required. He had seen enough deception and death to know that the most obvious explanations were often the most wrong, and Fletcher's disappearance struck him as anything but ordinary. Winters organized a search party within hours of Greeley's report, gathering 12 of Millfield's most capable men for what he knew would be a difficult and potentially dangerous investigation. The searchers included Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose tracking skills rivaled those of the local Indians, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hiding place within 50 miles of town. What the search party discovered defied all rational explanation. Fletcher's trail led clearly toward the Hardin farm, marked by occasional drops of what appeared to be blood and torn fabric caught on thorns. The sign suggested that the merchant had been alive but injured when he left the road, possibly struggling against captives who were forcing him deeper into the wilderness. But at the exact boundary of Hardin property, every trace of Fletcher's passage simply ceased to exist. The searchers spent hours examining the area where the trail ended, looking for any sign that might indicate Fletcher's fate. They found nothing. No evidence of struggle, no hidden blood, no disturbed earth. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted from the ground by invisible hands and carried away into thin air. Even Henrik Johansson, whose tracking abilities were legendary, admitted defeat when confronted with such a complete absence of evidence. The Hardin family's account. When Winters questioned Ezekiel Hardin about the missing merchant, the patriarch's response was both cooperative and strangely rehearsed. Yes, Fletcher had stopped at the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset and seeking directions to a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel had warned him against taking unfamiliar trails, especially with winter weather approaching and valuable goods, but Fletcher had insisted on trying the route. The merchant had been polite but hurried, declining Temperance's offer of a hot meal and a warm bed in favor of pressing on while daylight remained. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had seemed nervous and distracted, constantly looking over his shoulder and checking his saddlebags as if expecting pursuit. When asked about this behavior, Fletcher had mentioned seeing strange men following him since leaving Virginia, but had dismissed Ezekiel's suggestion that he remain at the farm until a larger party could escort him to safety. The last the family had seen of him, Fletcher was riding north toward the Ridge country, determined to find his shortcut despite threatening weather and growing darkness. Ezekiel's account was corroborated in exact detail by his entire family, each member providing identical descriptions of Fletcher's visit. They remembered his dismissal of their warnings, his urgency, even his precise words when declining their hospitality. Temperance recalled that the merchant had complained of stomach problems and had accepted a small bottle of her herbal medicine before departing. Caleb had offered to escort Fletcher to the Ridge Trail, but the merchant had refused, claiming that his business was too urgent for delays. Their consistency should have been reassuring to Constable Winters. Instead, it struck him as unnaturally perfect, like a story that had been carefully practiced and rehearsed until every detail was fixed in memory. Real witnesses in Winters' experience always agreed on major points while contradicting each other on minor ones. The Hardens' account was too complete, too polished, too free of the small inconsistencies that marked genuine testimony. Suspicious changes to the farm. The constable's suspicions deepened when he noticed significant changes in the farm's layout since his last visit several months earlier. A new smokehouse had been built near the main barn, unusually large for a family operation, and constructed with thick stone walls that seemed designed for more than food preservation. Fresh earth surrounded several outbuildings, as if extensive digging projects had recently taken place. Most peculiar of all, the family's root cellar appeared to have been substantially enlarged, with new timber supports visible around an entrance that now seemed large enough to accommodate a wagon. When Winters asked about these improvements, Ezekiel explained that the family had enjoyed an exceptionally profitable harvest and had decided to invest in better facilities for storing and processing their crops. The enlarged root cellar was necessary for the increased volume of preserved foods and vegetables they planned to sell in Lexington, while the new smokehouse would allow them to cure meat for both commercial sale and family use. The explanations were reasonable and well delivered. But something in Ezekiel's manner suggested he was choosing his words with unusual care. Most disturbing of all, the family's usual warmth seemed forced during Winter's visit, their famous hospitality carrying an undercurrent of nervous energy that the constable couldn't ignore. Temperance's hands shook slightly as she served coffee, and Mercy kept glancing toward her father, as if seeking approval for every word she spoke. Even Josiah and Caleb, normally outgoing and confident young men, seemed subdued and watchful in ways that suggested they were hiding something significant. But without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was little Constable Winters could legally do. Fletcher's case was officially recorded as a probable Indian attack or highway robbery. His name added to the growing list of frontier casualties that marked the price of westward expansion. The merchant's horse was sold at auction to cover his outstanding debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher existed only in the memories of those who had known him. A pattern of vanishings. Yet Fletcher's disappearance would prove to be just the beginning of a pattern that would terrorize the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, transforming a prosperous farming community into a place where parents kept their children close to home after dark and travelers whispered warnings. Throughout the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the disappearances continued with terrifying regularity that defied all rational explanation. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would vanish without explanation along the same stretch of road, creating a zone of fear that stretched for nearly 20 miles in every direction from Millfield. The victims varied dramatically in traveling circumstances, wealth, and age: solitary merchants like Fletcher, small family groups, even heavily armed parties traveling together for mutual protection. What united them was their complete disappearance, and the fact that each had been seen heading toward or inquiring about directions to the Harden farm before vanishing into the wilderness. Dr. Marcus Cromwell disappeared in November during his journey from Richmond to establish a medical practice in Louisville. The 43-year-old physician had been carrying his entire life's work in the form of medical instruments, books, and supplies worth over $300, an investment that represented years of planning and saving. His wagon had been found overturned near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Harden farm, with the contents scattered but apparently untouched. Local authorities assumed that Cromwell had been thrown from his seat during an accident and had wandered into the wilderness in a state of confusion, eventually dying of exposure. The explanation seemed reasonable until searchers discovered that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the wreckage. The leather satchel contained surgical instruments of exceptional quality, including an amputation kit and a bone saw that would be invaluable to anyone attempting to practice frontier medicine. Ordinary thieves would have been more interested in the trade goods and coins that remained scattered around the crash site, and no wild animal would have taken such items. The Henley family vanished in December during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 young children had been seeking shelter when their wagon became mired in a snowdrift only half a mile from the Harden farm. According to Ezekiel's subsequent account, the family had never reached his property despite the short distance, presumably becoming lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wilderness. Their bodies were never found despite extensive searches conducted when the weather cleared. What made the Henley case particularly disturbing was the discovery of their wagon a week after the storm. The vehicle had been pulled from the snowdrift and abandoned beside the road, thoroughly searched and cleaned of snow. The family's personal belongings and clothing were gone, but their tools and food supplies remained untouched. Most puzzling of all, tracks around the wagon suggested that multiple people had worked together to free it from the drift, an act that would have required considerable effort and time in dangerous weather. January brought the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher carrying donations for a new church in Frankfurt. Cross was known throughout the region for his fearless travels through even the most dangerous areas of the frontier and his powerful sermons. The 50-year-old minister had survived countless natural hazards, bandits, and Indian attacks during 15 years of preaching, making his disappearance particularly shocking to communities that had come to view him as indestructible. Cross's horse was found 3 days after his disappearance, still carrying saddlebags that contained nearly $200 in church donations. The money's presence ruled out robbery as a motive, but raised disturbing questions about what kind of threat could have overcome such an experienced and resourceful man. Local authorities eventually concluded that Cross had suffered a stroke or heart attack while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded the Wilderness Road. The Hardens' unassailable reputation. Each disappearance followed the same inexplicable pattern: trails that led inevitably toward Harden property before vanishing completely, scattered personal belongings suggesting sudden violence or struggle, and abandoned horses found grazing loose or tied to trees. Yet, whenever questioned by increasingly suspicious authorities, the Harden family presented plausible explanations that were impossible to disprove. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but usually from a distance and only briefly. Each victim had been warned about various dangers, difficult terrain, bad weather, reports of bandit activity, but had chosen to continue their journey despite the family's concerned advice. In several cases, the Hardens had offered escort services, shelter, or food that had been politely declined by travelers who seemed determined to maintain their schedules regardless of risk. Constable Winters found himself trapped in an impossible situation that grew more frustrating with each new disappearance. The Hardens were among the most respected families in the county, their reputation for Christian virtue and charity unquestioned by everyone except him. Ezekiel's sermons continued to draw crowds from surrounding townships, his biblical knowledge and passionate delivery impressing even educated ministers like Reverend Cole. Temperance's medical skills had saved dozens of lives during the previous summer's fever outbreak, earning her a reputation that bordered on sainthood among grateful families. To accuse such pillars of the community without ironclad proof would be social ostracism and professional suicide. Winters had seen what happened to lawmen who made accusations they couldn't prove. They found themselves unemployed, friendless, and sometimes facing charges of their own. The frontier operated on a complex web of mutual obligations and personal relationships, and attacking the wrong family could destroy a man's life more effectively than any legal proceeding. Moreover, the family's explanations, while consistently convenient, were entirely believable within the context of frontier life. The Wilderness Road was genuinely dangerous, plagued by severe weather, hostile Indians, bandits, and the countless natural hazards that claimed lives regularly. Dozens of travelers disappeared each year under circumstances far less mysterious than those surrounding the Harden farm. What made this cluster of vanishings different was purely statistical. Too many people too close together. All last seen in the same general area. But statistics meant little in a world where evidence was everything, and evidence seemed to evaporate like morning mist whenever investigators approached the Harden property. The family welcomed searches of their buildings and grounds, answered questions with apparent openness, and even provided volunteers for search parties that combed the surrounding wilderness for signs of the missing travelers. Their cooperation was so complete and enthusiastic that it felt almost like mockery to the increasingly frustrated constable. Timothy Voran's disturbing testimony. The first crack in the family's carefully maintained facade came from an unexpected source, 9-year-old Timothy Voran, whose family lived on a small homestead 2 miles east of the Harden farm. Timothy was known throughout the community as an imaginative child who loved to explore the woods around his family's property, often returning home with elaborate stories about the natural wonders and wildlife he had discovered during his adventures. In March 1799, young Timothy approached Constable Winters with a story that initially seemed like another product of childish imagination. The boy claimed he had been exploring the woods near Beaver Creek when he heard screaming coming from the direction of the Harden farm. But these weren't the kind of screams that came from childbirth, arguments, or even accidents. They were the sustained, desperate cries of someone in mortal terror, rising and falling in patterns that suggested both psychological torment and physical pain. According to Timothy, he had heard such sounds at least 5 times over the winter, always during the darkest hours of night, when decent folk should be asleep. The screaming would continue for what seemed like hours, sometimes accompanied by other sounds that the boy couldn't identify, the creak of pulleys or ropes, rhythmic hammering, and occasionally what sounded like multiple voices chanting in unison. The sounds always ended abruptly, followed by a silence so complete that Timothy wondered if he had imagined the entire episode. When Winters questioned the boy's parents, they admitted to hearing strange sounds themselves, but had dismissed them as natural phenomena common to frontier life. Animal calls distorted by distance and wind perhaps, or the sounds of nocturnal predators hunting in the wilderness. After all, the Hardens were good Christian folk who had never given anyone cause for suspicion. What possible explanation could there be for screaming in the night coming from such a respectable household? Timothy's account might have been dismissed as misinterpreted natural sounds or childhood imagination, except for one detail that gave Constable Winters considerable pause. When pressed for specifics, the boy could accurately describe the approximate dates when he had heard the screaming, and each corresponded exactly with the estimated time of a traveler's disappearance. The correlation was too consistent to be explained by chance, too precise to be coincidental. Gathering discrete evidence. Armed with Timothy Voran's disturbing testimony, Constable Winters began to build a case against the Harden family with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accusations against such prominent citizens would require absolutely unassailable proof. He started by quietly interviewing other neighbors who lived within hearing distance of the farm, asking carefully worded questions that wouldn't alert the Hardens to his investigation or reveal his growing suspicions. What emerged from these discreet inquiries was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained phenomena that had been overlooked, rationalized away, or dismissed by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was minor when considered individually, but together they painted a picture that made Winters' blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm lay closest to the Harden property, recalled several nights when she had seen unusual activity at their homestead. Lanterns moving between buildings at hours when decent folk should be sleeping, the sounds of heavy construction and digging that seemed to continue until dawn. When she had mentioned these observations to Temperance Harden after church services, the woman had offered a reasonable explanation. The family was working on extensive improvements to their root cellar and other storage facilities, and they preferred to do such labor during cool night hours rather than waste precious daylight that could be spent tending crops. The explanation had satisfied Sarah at the time, but in retrospect, she realized that the nighttime construction had continued for months longer than any reasonable building project would require. Moreover, she had never seen evidence of the massive amounts of excavated earth that such extensive digging should have produced. When pressed by Winters for more details, Sarah admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices and occasionally what might have been cries of pain or distress. Old Henrik Johansson, whose farm bordered the Harden property to the north, reported findings that were even more troubling. The Swedish immigrant, whose hunting and tracking skills were legendary throughout the county, had discovered animal bones scattered along their shared fence line. Not the normal remains of butchered livestock, but bones that had been cracked, processed, and gnawed in ways that suggested something far more sinister than ordinary farming activities. The bones included skulls and long bones from cattle, horses, and pigs, but also smaller fragments that Johansson couldn't identify despite his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed evidence of being deliberately broken with tools, while others bore saw marks that suggested systematic dismemberment rather than predator activity or natural decomposition. When Johansson had approached Ezekiel about the mysterious bone deposits, the patriarch had offered a plausible but somehow unsatisfying explanation. Wild animals had been particularly troublesome that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased livestock carcasses by scattering the remains throughout the woods. The bone fragments were simply the result of weather and scavengers breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. But Johansson's trained eye had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and too widely distributed to be the result of natural decomposition. Moreover, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of diseased animals. Most tellingly, several